that we're under, and the importance of data management and how it can be leveraged. The whole reason why we do what we're doing is really about business resilience. That's really what we're focused about. You know, we can spend a lot of time talking about, you know, data and all those kind of things, but at the end of the day, it's there to support the business itself, and that's ultimately our role. But we've been hyper-focused on data resilience, and we've been focused on that since probably the mid-90s, and rolling along until probably the 2015 or so, where what we were worried about was things like hardware resilience, storage device resilience, recoverability, and those kind of things. And we were very focused on disaster recovery. But since cyber recovery has become so important, we've landed up with something very different, which is what I'm going to be talking about, which is around cyber resilience. And it's the ability to defend yourself against attackers versus just defending yourself against something like a natural disaster. And so if I ask a question, who here is leveraging or it plans to leverage their disaster recovery plan for cyber recovery? Or do you have a cyber recovery plan? Just show of hands. So one of the challenges that you have when you're relying on a disaster recovery plan when it comes to cyber resilience is during a disaster, the one thing you can do is you can count on your data. When you had that data center fire or sprinkler, whatever it was, your data was in a known state, it was trusted, and then what you did is you proceeded forward to actually go through a process to recover your data in an alternative location, whatever that is. The problem with cyber recovery is we cannot trust the data. And that's the thing that I'd like you to take away from this, is rethinking what that plan is. And I'll go through a bunch of ideas here for what that plan could be when you're recovering from a cyber attack versus disaster recovery. So data resilience was really, in the old days, focused around backup and recovery. We had backup systems. We took our data, we stored it on there, we stored it for long periods of time, whatever it may have been, and we recovered with that. And there were certain capabilities tied to that we focused on. But as we move forward, we now need to start focusing on the security aspect. Concepts such as cyber vaulting really need to be thought about. How do I leverage my backup data for threat intelligence and hunting and everything else that goes with it versus just relying on our production machines for that? And so security is now very, very important for us to focus on. So how did we get here? So as time moved on, when I recall when I got in the industry in the early 90s, the amount of data we were dealing with was just, it was an absolute fraction of what we're dealing with today. I remember selling storage arrays with 600 gigabytes on them. And now we're talking about organizations with petabytes on there. The other problem is we started to distribute that data. So we went from core data centers with our data in there to then we started getting a lot of data at the edge. Then cloud came into it, so we started getting a lot of data into the cloud. Then SaaS solutions came along. And what that did is gave us sprawl. So data sprawl, essentially security sprawl is really what it amounts to. We've got inconsistency right across the board. So that all leads to lack of insight. That's really the bottom line. And the other challenge we have is each one of these has different tool sets. So we might have the same tool sets from one data center to another, but when we look at bringing AWS and Azure and all those other players into this, every one of them has a different tool set. And if we think about it, if we go back to say about 2013, 2014, those clouds didn't even have data management tool sets. It wasn't even a thought. And most backup products couldn't even run in those clouds. So how could you get control on this? How could you actually deploy a consistent policy right across these various different data centers and clouds and so forth? And that's really what has got us into this problem. So it's important to follow a framework in order to get control of this. So at Cohesity, we follow the NIST model, which is around identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And each one of these pillars really focuses in and helps your organization understand what you should be doing so that you can get cyber resilience and recoverability at the end of the day. And it all starts off when you look at the identify phase. And the identify phase is really about knowing what you have. So know what you don't know. If I don't know what assets I have out there, I don't know how to protect them. I don't know how to secure them. I can't even find out what data is on them. The protect side is probably the easiest side because we've been doing that forever. So from the mid-90s, we've been protecting data, but now it's kind of shifted, and we're looking at now on how do we protect the system that's protecting our data? How do we make sure that is available so that when we need to recover, it is available to recover? Then moving into the detection side of things, the earlier we can detect something, the better we are to be able to respond to that. There's no point finding out 2 weeks after a machine's been encrypted that it got encrypted. We want to know that as soon as possible. We want to know that there are threats on those machines if we can as soon as possible. Our response also needs to be very different. When we looked at a disaster, the respond pillar really didn't need to be much of a concern because we went from the protect and we jumped directly to the recover because we trusted our data. But the other 3 pillars in there are critical to cyber recovery because we've got to know a lot more information before we actually eventually get to our recover side of things. So identification is not only about identifying the assets themselves, and that's become easier over the years. So if you're in a cloud like AWS or Azure or Google, the platform itself does keep track of a lot of that inventory. It's very easy for us to actually import that inventory and give you visibility. But at the same time, there are other things which give you a lot of trouble in actually understanding those assets. So if you still have physical machines and so forth, they're not as easy to discover. And that's where you start looking at third-party solutions and trying to integrate this so that you can understand what the inventory is that you have in your organization. The other part of this is about classification. So classification is critical because we can't treat all data the same. I've spoken to too many organizations and asked them what their data management policy is. And I get a simple answer, which is, I treat everything the same. The problem with that is you're either under-protecting everything or you're over-protecting everything. And that's not what we do in life. In life, what we do is we treat things with less important value in a particular way and things with a lot more importance in a different way. So we lock our jewels up in a safe at the bank, but we might put our passports in a safe at home, and we leave a couple of $5 bills lying around in a drawer. Each one of them has a different policy because of its value to us. And we need to start looking at data that way. And with data classification, whether that be manual or automated, allows us to determine what policy we put on what type of data, and that ultimately leads into cost savings. And then the other side of this is what we call Posture Advisor. And Posture Advisor is around what we would call security drift. And security drift is about day one, we can set up something and we can make it very secure. But what does that look like on day 30, day 60, day 90? And then finally, there are a whole lot of companies coming out there with data security, posture management, and so forth. So do you have a platform which can integrate with those? can you bring this all together into single user interfaces and get information about this? And that's really critical in the identify space. I was talking about data classification earlier, and if you have a look at this, can I scan a machine automatically and find out, do I have IP addresses on there? Do I have PII information on there? Is that medium sensitivity, low, high, etc.? That is going to allow me to start building out those policies I was talking about. The security posture advisor was talking about. As mentioned earlier, when I deploy a solution, professional services come in, they pull out a checklist, and the checklist is a full hardening guide, and it says, okay, do this, and do this, and do this, and do this. At the end of that day, I've got a pretty secure system. But as time moves on, you might open up a support case, and someone might go, well, I'm going to remove a particular user from there, or I'm going to open up SSH, or whatever that may be, and forget to go back in there and clean that up. And that is what results in security drift. And if you're not monitoring for security drift, 6 months later, you could find out that you got holes all over your system, and now you're vulnerable, whereas you weren't day one. So having something that continuously monitors for this is very important, and then having actionable remediation steps is critical to this. Moving into the protect side of things. So once upon a time, as mentioned, we protected our data, we stored our data. But we didn't care that much about things. We had administrators who had access to all this data. They could delete things, add things, and so forth. And there was a lot of inherent trust there. But as we've moved forward, that trust has waned. And so now we have to look at things like least privilege models. What access does a person need to get their job done and no more? And it might not be about them themselves, but what happens if they get compromised? What impact can they have? Things like encryption have become critical. I remember systems where the data was all in open text on the back end, and that then became a source for data to be extracted, which is used today for ransomware attacks. Immutability. So I talked about the whole idea about trust, that during a cyber attack, we cannot trust our data. With our data management solution, we want to trust that data. We want to know that that backup that I took a week ago is exactly that backup I have today. And so immutability is critical to that. But the other side of this is I want to make sure that that data hasn't been deleted, because a lot of attacks will start off actually at the data management side of things, come in under the OS, and they'll start deleting file systems and everything else, leaving you in a state where you actually have no choice but to pay a ransom because all that data has been deleted. And so having something immutable is critical. Zero trust, well, we're hearing that all over the place. We can't trust anyone. It makes no difference who they are. We can't trust them. And then two things I'm going to talk a little bit more about is the concept of an air gap, and then something called separation of duties, because this adds an additional layer of security on top of your data management that you should be thinking about. So when we look at separation of duties, what we want to do is we want to remove unilateral control from any individual for certain critical tasks. So you might have a super admin operating your environment, trustworthy, been with the organization forever, no issues. But what we do know is we know that people's credentials get compromised. We know that multi-factor has been compromised out there. There are a whole variety of ways in which that individual can get compromised, and the trust for them goes away, not because of them as an individual, but because of what's going on out there. And so how do we prevent that? And so having separation of duties, or the concept of quorum, become critical. The ability for someone to actually go and make a change, but that change not to take effect until it's been approved by multiple people. This raises visibility to those changes, number one. And number two, it prevents unintentional compromises to a system. So how does something like this look? Well, we have someone, they've got all the privileges to do something. They go in and they initiate an operation which is covered by quorum. When they've done that, what it does is goes into a workflow where that request will be sent to other approvers via email. So that raises visibility. So now if I had a group of 10 people, I've got 10 people who know that a change has been requested. I then have a certain number of those people the ability to either approve or deny that action. Once that happens, if it's approved, that operation goes through, and if it's denied, it's blocked. And so this is fantastic for things like policy changes, backup deletions, the adding of users, and all those various different things which could be vectors of an attack, we can now prevent using these kind of workflows. And this is critical, and this is becoming a must-have for systems. The next concept is about isolation, or data isolation. So data isolation, if we go back to the 90s, was pretty easy, right? We backed up, we went to tape. Tape went off-site. We got our isolation immediately. We got disaster recovery and those kind of things. Then as we kind of marched forward into the early 2000s, we started depending on disk-based systems. And with the disk-based systems, we got things like replication, but we lost our air gap because we had systems which are connected by networks. We had the same users which had access to both sites. And so during a cyber attack, it actually became quite easy to attack both sides. So now we're going to start looking at how do I separate things which are on premises so that I create this air gap, and a true air gap. There are vendors out there who talk about an on-appliance air gap. There is no such thing. An air gap is either a completely separate unit and preferably off-site and off-network with not only network isolation but operational isolation as well. And then we step into things like SaaS isolation. And SaaS isolation kind of takes all the complexity out of managing these and really makes it simple. So leveraging a service which is cloud-based, it's off-network, it's got operational isolation, and it's got security controls around it which make sure that the only thing that data can do within these services is expire. So I put data in, if it's got a 90-day expiry, 90 days later it will expire. Until that point, the data lives there. There is no choice. And so you need this flexibility because all organizations are different. Moving into the detect side of the house. So detection is so critical because the moment something happens in your organization typically means that your frontline tools miss something. And we know you've got lots of tools there which are looking for these things. But at some point, all cyber attacks land up occurring because a tool missed something. And so what we need is detection capabilities to understand when they missed it, and also how are we going to leverage our backup data for things like threat hunting. If our frontline systems are down, how do I know what hit me? I need to go into this backup data. And I can't afford to recover the full amount of data, analyze it, work out that I don't quite know what's going on there, then bring up another backup and so forth. I need instant access to this data. And I need to be able to do each one of these things to that data without having to actually move that data. So it's critical having a system that can do this. The other thing that's critical as well is tying into the rest of the organization. It's one thing having a platform which has got alerts and emails and those kind of things, but does it tie into your security operations center and so forth? Can it trigger workflows within your operations center to alert other people and trigger other actions which are not related to your data management solution? And can you take third-party threat feeds and so forth and feed it into these systems? All of these are critical to having a good cyber response strategy. So if we look at, say, anomaly detection. So anomaly detection looks for very different indicators to what frontline tools look for. So these are AI-based control mechanisms where what they do is over a 2-week period establish a baseline for backups. That baseline is going to include things like the amount of file changes and adds. It's going to include things like the randomness of data, as well as dedupe rates and all those various different things. And it builds out a norm for that. And the moment we step out of that norm, we raise an alert and we say we see an anomaly. It doesn't necessarily mean we've got malware, but it just means something anomalous has happened in the environment, and that then is an early indicator and allows us to respond. Once we get those indicators, now we can start using other tool sets. So tool sets which can actually take those machines, present them to an engine which can actually go and scan through and look at each individual file, look at the registry, look at all these various different things, and using rules to actually identify what type of IOC we're dealing with. So here what we see is a bunch of machines where we've seen some anomalies. They then get a secondary assessment, and with that secondary assessment we can actually get what those IOCs are. We can get reports for those, and those reports then are fed back to the security teams. Security teams now have an idea on what they are dealing with. And that's great for the last backup, but what happens if we want to start getting a lot more targeted with this threat hunting? What happens if we want to build our own rules, or even look at this over a time sequence? Because when did this get in there? We know it didn't get in there yesterday. If it triggered yesterday, it didn't get in yesterday and trigger yesterday. It probably got in a week ago, 2 weeks ago, 3 months ago. We don't know. And so now we need tools which can allow us to actually dig in and look over a time series, and also look for particular threats and make it a lot quicker. And so being able to, put custom rules in, or go to your security vendor, whether it be CrowdStrike or whoever it is, get their rule sets and put it into this becomes critical. And then coming back to data classification, if I didn't know what was on a machine, I do need to know what's on that machine, because when I go back to my executives and I say machine A, B, C, and D were compromised, the first question they're going to ask is, what was on there? What were those machines doing? And if I can come back and go, well, I had a whole lot of PII information on there, the reaction is going to be very, very different versus, well, that was a Linux machine which the test dev department stood up and there was no data on there. Very, very different response from the execs based on this information. And this is absolutely critical. Otherwise, you're not going to know what that business impact is to that compromise. So how do we do this? Well, there are a lot of methods out there. One of those is to just use something called regex. And regex is good at assessing a whole variety of data, but it's very inaccurate as to what it actually pulls out, because it doesn't know whether a name, if we've got a person's name in there, it doesn't know if that person's name was a person's name or a street address or just some sort of identification in documents. So you need regex on top of a variety of other tool sets to be able to really dig down and come back and go, okay, this was PII information. It wasn't just the name of a file, something like that. So we need to get to something which is going to give us accurate results, because the problem is if we don't have accurate results, then we have a whole variety of false positives, and when we've got too many false positives, everyone ignores everything. And that's how things sneak by as well. Looking at the response side of things, and this is where I said earlier that we've got to respond very differently to a disaster. So the idea of a clean room during a disaster is unnecessary. We trust our data. We don't need to do threat hunting. We don't need business impact assessments, all those various different things. So the response side of things is really, really critical. And I'm going to dig into the clean room side of things a little bit here and cover this, because does anyone have a clean room? Does anyone have a clean room strategy here? Okay, so that just shows the concern here, I speak to a lot of companies, and most companies don't have a clean room strategy, and that's the reason for bringing this up. So what is a clean room? Okay, it's a secure, isolated environment where you can actually control the access for what you do in there. So when you have a cyber attack, you're not going to recover back to your production environment. The problem with recovering to your production environment is whatever vectors you had on there can re-trigger, and most often will re-trigger in your production environment. So you need to bring that into isolated environments where the attackers don't know what you're doing because it's isolated. You've controlled access with your own people, and it's completely segmented. It's also an area where you're going to do forensics. What am I dealing with? Just because I had a cyber attack, there are hundreds of cyber attacks, if not thousands. What am I dealing with? How am I going to clear this up? What was patient zero? And when I start working out how I'm going to recover, how I'm going to simulate that, I'm not going to do that in production. And then it's also used for eradication. So I said earlier, you can't trust the data. Just because yesterday's backup wasn't encrypted does not mean it's malware free. I've got to go in there and I've got to hunt down those files which are going to re-trigger. I've got to eradicate them. I've got to fix them. I've got to work on that data before I ever bring it back into production. And that is what a clean room is all about. And so the first step about a clean room is, well, number one, you need a strategy. Second is you need flexibility, because you don't know where you're going to need this clean room. Establishing one in the cloud is one option. Can I get the data there? Is the data there? And so forth. Is it going to be on premises? Do I have access to my data centers to be able to do this? Or can I rely on partners to provide a clean room? But you've got to have a strategy around this. And the strategy not only is this isolated environment, but it's the tool sets which are going to be on there as well. So there's no point just having a virtual environment to recover to. I need to have all the tool sets that are at my front line so that I can assess what damage is there, I can clean things up and everything else. And so that's why it's all about strategy and understanding how you're going to build it, what tool sets are going to be there, who's going to have access, how's it going to be isolated, how am I going to get the data from there back into production once I've got that. Talking about tool sets, you're going to pick your vendor of choice. So whoever you're using is going to be a product that you're going to run in there. A question there?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but because you were talking about the clean room, I wanted to understand, is it when the attack is happening, and I know you said it's recovery, so are you trying to isolate that part of the network and the data, or is it after the attack has happened and then you're trying to recover? Like, what point in time is that clean room being used?
So the question is, when is the clean room being used? Is it there to sort of isolate the attack when it's happening, or is it something after the attack? So typically, it's after the attack. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be that, but it's typically after the attack. So you've been attacked, you've probably pulled a tripwire, you've shut everything down, now you're going into your respond phase. And in your respond phase, you're not going to use your production environment for that because you shut everything down. The clean room is where you're now going to start doing your assessments. It's typically after the fact. So it could either exist, or it's something that you'll need to stand up dynamically. But if you don't have a strategy, you're not even going to know what it looks like to stand it up dynamically. Okay? So just getting back, so you're going to choose your tool sets which are going to run in this environment. Here I'm using Tenable as an example, but it doesn't have to be strictly them. We may need to go into those machines and look for what information was on them, because we may not have that information, and we're going to have to report that up. And we're also going to use this to hunt for artifacts as well. So, where you're getting your feed from, what tool set are you going to use to dig into that, etc. You're going to need to really understand that. And then after the attack, the company is going to come back and they're going to look for root cause analysis. And so you're back up and running. You're still going to have your clean room in place. And this is when you're going to start looking at incident timeline. When did this get in there? And this is where I'm going to step back in time. I may have to go back 3 months, 6 months, and work out how did the attack get in there? How did it propagate through the organization? And then finally, we're in a state that we can actually recover. And with that, we're going to rely on a number of techniques, but those are pretty well understood. Ideally, you want orchestration and so forth in there. So really, it's a matter of, how do we go from backup and recovery to cyber recovery? So if we rely on our backup and recovery methods, what we do is we land up with a very, very long time frame to recover. Things are very manual, very unprepared, and getting back up and running could be literally weeks, and that is not good for businesses. Modern cyber recovery is about automation, it's about immediate access to data, and eventually it's about restore. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to increase the speed of this. Let's just get this there. Okay, ignore that last one. We're trying to increase the speed of it. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to take what often is maybe a 4, 5, 6 week effort and reduce that down to maybe a couple of days. Because every single day that you're out of business, you're in trouble. The other takeaway here is security is a team sport. So any vendor who says all you need is my product and my product will take care of everything, they're incorrect. It's a team sport. There are other organizations out there who have expertise in certain areas, and bringing these all together in your cyber recovery is critical, because otherwise you're going to recover and you're going to go back down again, and then eventually you're going to work out that you need more than one organization to help you out. So as a takeaway, consider what is your minimum viable company. So this is, what are those assets that you're going to need to get that business operational? It might only be 10% of your organization, but you have to understand what that is. Is that door access systems? Is that your telephony? Is that your HR systems? Whatever it may be, you have to understand what that is. And then you've also got to ask a lot of these questions. If you don't have yes to the majority of these, you really should be looking at your environment and looking at changing out your tool sets so that you can get these. Because if you don't have these, then the attackers are going to get the upper hand, and you're going to be paying a ransom. And just paying a ransom does not mean you're going to be up and running. It means you just paid a ransom, but you still got a whole recovery strategy left. And so with that, I want to thank you. Thank you for your attention. And if there are any questions, I can take questions. No? Well, thank you very much.